What is sound? And why do we care? Electronic music is made up of organized sounds. So to better understand electronic music, let's start by getting into the scientific foundations of sound. Sound is produced by a vibrating source that causes matter around it to move. No sound is produced in a vacuum. Matter, whether it's air, water, or earth, must be present. The vibration of the source causes it to push and pull on its neighboring particles, which in turn push and pull on their neighbors, and so on. The pushes increase air pressure, or compression, while pulls decrease air pressure, or rarefaction. These push-pull oscillations of air pressure create a wave that moves through the air. We call the movement of the waves propagation. Waves propagate from the source as an ever-expanding sphere. What reaches our microphones and ears is a fraction of the energy present at the source. Particles that propagate a wave move in a couple different ways. In the case of transverse waves, the individual particles oscillate in a perpendicular motion relative to the wave propagation. In the case of longitudinal waves, the particles oscillate parallel to the propagation of the wave. Simple waves are easy to plot over time. In this case, we are plotting relative changes in air pressure. When the air is compressed, the plot line draws above the median, and when the air is rarefied, the plot line draws below the median. A wave is said to be periodic when it repeats regularly. When the repetition is smooth and regular, like in this graph, we call it simple harmonic motion. Plots of simple harmonic motion allow us to measure wave characteristics. Amplitude, or the amount of pressure deviation in each oscillation, roughly correlates to volume or loudness, though we will clarify later why this is not a direct relationship. Frequency, as measured in hertz, aka oscillations or cycles per second, tightly correlates to our perception of pitch. Wavelength is the distance a wave travels during one cycle. Period is the time it takes for one cycle to complete. Wavelength is relevant to instrument design and acoustics. You need a longer string or a bigger room to get resonance at lower frequencies. Phase is the measure of the position within a cycle. You may have used phase properly before when describing the state of the moon within its 23 1/3 day cycle. In the case of phases of the moon, we give them each names like new, waxing crescent, full, waning gibbon, etc. In the case of audio, we use degrees or radians to notate phase. There are 360 degrees or 2 pi radians in one cycle. Knowing phase is especially valuable when predicting how two waves of equal amplitude and frequency will interact when they're combined. When two waves of the same frequency and amplitude have the same phase, they combine constructively, doubling in amplitude. When the same two waves are inversed or have a 180-degree phase shift, they combine destructively, aka they subtract from each other or cancel out. Phase differences between those two extremes split the difference between doubling and canceling out. Phase differences can be introduced by changing how a signal is generated or amplified. Differences can also be introduced through variations in time. You can hear this by playing two copies of the same square wave and changing a very short digital delay on one of the waves. As the delay changes, some of the frequencies in the signal will have a period that lines up with the delay such that you get destructive interference, while other frequencies will line up to get a sum or constructive interference. Waves do not need to have the same frequency to combine. We often combine multiple simple harmonic waves of different frequencies to create complex waves. One can even say that all complex periodic waves may be created with a combination of simple harmonic waves. To do this, we need to think not in terms of amplitude over time as we have seen in our waveform displays, but in amplitude over frequency, also known as a spectrogram. You can more easily see the recipe of a complex wave via spectrogram. From this analysis, you can generate complex waves like sawtooth waves or square waves by combining sine waves in a specific way through additive synthesis. thing about spectrograms is they can provide information on sounds that are non-harmonic too. Technically, any continuous sound can be represented by summing signs. A click is technically all the frequencies at once for a very short amount of time. White noise is all frequencies together at the same amplitude, aka equal energy per unit frequency. Pink noise, on the other hand, which kind of sounds like filtered white noise, has its energy distribution equal per octave. We use pink noise a lot for testing audio systems as it better aligns with our hearing system, but more on that later. So far we've only talked about clinical, kind of synthetic signals, but what about musical sounds? They're a lot more complex as they change over time. As it turns out, we can update our spectrogram over time and plot or follow the spectral changes in real time. Ableton 10 Suite users have a plugin called Spectrum that lets you do this quite easily. You may have picked up already that Spectrum relates to one of our favorite ideas in electronic music, timbre. Timbre is defined as the quality of a continuous sound that is distinct from its frequency and its amplitude. You may have discussed it before as tone, tonal color, these sorts of things. It is the complex and unexpected timbres in electronic music that get me so excited about the genres within it. So far, we've talked about the units of frequency or hertz, that they relate to our sense of pitch, and combining different frequencies in different amplitudes to create different spectra or timbre. But we haven't talked as much about amplitude itself or any of the units related to amplitude. I've pushed the discussion of amplitude back in this talk a little bit, as it's easy to speak in colloquial terms where amplitude, volume, and loudness get interchanged, but in music technology these terms are differentiated, so we need to be a little more precise. Moving forward, we'll focus on amplitude as a physical measure in decibels. Decibels are a log scale that let us represent a wide range of sound pressures into a small number of digits. A range of, say, 0 to 100, or 3 significant digits, represents much of what we need to account for in music. Without dB, we would need more than 10 significant digits at the extremes. Also, decibels can be processed quickly in our heads. Reducing intensity by half, subtract 6 decibels. Half again, subtract another 6 decibels. Most of us can handle subtracting 12 from any number in our heads. I can't speak for y'all, but I would struggle to divide an arbitrary 6 to 10 digit number by 4 in my head. We can think of decibels in two contexts in production. One is the relative change to a no change level, as in a mixer. The other is relative to an arbitrary level, such as the threshold of hearing. Sound pressure level, or SPL, of a given sound source changes as we get further away from it. In a free field, sound pressure reduces by 6 dB with every doubling of distance. Therefore, thunder from 2 kilometers away does not evaporate our faces. That said, let's look a little more closely at this. In this animation, the lightness and darkness represent amounts of compression and rarefaction respectively. The higher the contrast, the greater the amplitude. As the wave gets further from the source, the energy is dissipated and the contrast reduces. This is only possible in a free field, where there are no walls or floors to reflect or refract the wave back towards the source. Let's see what happens when you add boundaries, thus create an echoic environment. As you can see in the second animation, an echoic environment produces high amplitude regions throughout the space, even at a greater distance from the source. We can demonstrate a real-world echoic principle by playing an 880 Hz sine wave through speakers in your room. Move into the center of the room, away from the speakers, and while the sound is playing, move your head side to side a few centimeters. You should hear changes in amplitude as you encounter constructive and deconstructive interference. These interference changes are caused by summing all of the different reflections and refractions of the sound in the room. If you change the frequency higher or lower, you may notice that you have to move your head a little more or a little less to hear the interference changes. The change in the movement will correlate to the wavelength of the source signal. We've introduced a lot of vocabulary in this video so far. This vocabulary is used to help make objective discussions of sound more precise. In science and music, precision matters. For discussions to be constructive when talking about sound, there are times when that precision will help you understand what is happening and then take the most productive action. Before moving on to the next section, please know any of the vocabulary that is new to you and identify 3 areas in your music production where greater precision would be of value, specifically to you.